The wind over the Golan Heights carried the smell of dust and fuel, a dry, metallic scent that clung to the throat. The plateau looked calm from a distance, black volcanic rocks stretching toward a pale autumn sky. But beneath that stillness, engines were warming, radios were whispering, and men were trying not to think about how badly outnumbered they were. Inside a shallow defensive position scraped into the rock, an Israeli M60 tank idled quietly. The engine vibrated through the hull, a constant reminder that there would be no escape once the fighting began. Captain Amos Levin leaned forward, his eye pressed to the periscope, scanning the distant ridgeline. Somewhere beyond it, he knew, an armored force was assembling more tanks than he had ever seen in one place. "Check the loader," Amos said, his voice calm, almost flat. The gunner, Yossi Barak, nodded and slid another 105mm round into place. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. "How many hours until reserves?" Yossi asked. Amos didn't answer right away. He listened to the radio short bursts of clipped Hebrew, units checking in, voices tense but disciplined. "Long enough that we're on our own," Amos finally replied. Across the border, in a shallow valley lit by dull afternoon light, Syrian armored units were forming up in long, orderly lines. T-62 tanks sat nose to tail, their low silhouettes and smoothbore guns reflecting Soviet doctrine: overwhelm, advance, do not stop. Lieutenant Khaled El-Masri climbed into his tank, the metal still cool beneath his gloves. Inside, the smell of oil and fresh paint mixed with sweat. A Soviet advisor stood nearby, gesturing toward a map spread across the hood of a jeep. "The Israelis are thin," the advisor said. "Their tanks are good, but there are few of them. Once the first line collapses, you push through. Speed is everything." Khaled nodded. He believed in the plan. He believed in numbers. He had to. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the world seemed to explode. Syrian artillery opened up across the front, the thunder rolling over the plateau like a storm breaking all at once. Israeli positions shook as shells slammed into the rocky ground, sending shards of basalt and clouds of dust into the air. Contact. Contact along the entire line. A voice shouted over the Israeli radio. Amos tightened his grip on the controls. Through the dust, he saw them, dark shapes cresting the ridge, one after another, until the horizon itself seemed to move. Syrian tanks advanced in waves, engines roaring, guns forward. "Range?" Amos asked. 1,800 meters, Yossi replied. "Fire." The tank lurched as the gun thundered. A T-62 at the front of the formation erupted in flame, its turret snapping sideways. Almost instantly, another Israeli tank fired, then another. Smoke rose in thick columns, but the Syrian advance did not slow. For every tank destroyed, more rolled forward, closing the distance, their guns flashing in return. Explosions walked across the Israeli line, throwing dirt and fire skyward. Inside his T-62, Khaled felt the shockwaves hammer through the hull. Over the radio came frantic voices. "Vehicle hit. Left flank burning. Keep moving. Do not stop." A shell struck the ground just short of his tank, showering it with rock. Khaled shouted to his driver to keep advancing, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the engine. The Israelis fought from prepared positions, firing, reversing, shifting angles. Years of training showed in every movement. They did not panic. They counted shots. They picked targets. Night fell quickly. Flares burst overhead, bathing the battlefield in harsh white light. Burning tanks cast long, flickering shadows across the rock. An Israeli tank took a direct hit. Flames poured from the engine deck where hit. Yossi shouted. Smoke filled the compartment. Amos forced the hatch open, dragging Yossi out as ammunition cooked off behind them. Around them, the ground was littered with twisted metal and shattered track links. Into the radio, Amos spoke through coughing breaths. "We're still here. Still holding." Across the field, Khaled stared at the growing number of wrecked Syrian tanks, some still burning, crews scrambling away under fire. "They said they would break," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. By midnight, the battlefield was a graveyard of steel. The Syrian assault had lost momentum, but it had not stopped. And on the Israeli side, ammunition was running low, crews exhausted, eyes burning from smoke and fear. The wind swept over the Golan again, carrying with it the crackle of fires and the distant rumble of engines preparing for another push. Dawn came pale and cold, revealing what the night had hidden. The Golan Heights were littered with burned-out hulls, blackened steel frozen where it had died. Smoke drifted low across the plateau, stinging the eyes and coating everything in ash. For the men who had survived the night, there was no sense of victory, only the dull knowledge that the battle was not finished. Inside what remained of his tank unit, Captain Amos Levin felt the weight of every hour without sleep. His voice was hoarse when he spoke into the radio, reporting losses, counting who was still alive. Of the tanks that had gone into position the day before, barely a handful were still operational. Yossi Barak sat on the edge of a crater, helmet in his hands, staring at nothing. His hands shook now. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by exhaustion. If they come again, he said quietly, we won't stop them. Amos looked out over the open ground, now fully exposed by daylight. We stop them, he replied. Or we don't come back. Across the line, Syrian commanders gathered among their vehicles, voices tense and rising. The numbers were still on their side, but the cost was far higher than expected. Rows of destroyed T-62s marked the advance routes like warnings written in smoke. Lieutenant Khaled al-Masri stood beside his abandoned tank, watching mechanics try to revive damaged vehicles. He had lost friends in the night, men he had trained with, eaten with, joked with only hours before. The radio crackled with new orders. All units, the voice said, strained but firm. Prepare to advance. No withdrawal. The engines started again. By mid-morning, the ground began to tremble. Another Syrian push rolled forward, slower this time, formations less clean, crews more cautious. Israeli gunners waited until the tanks were close enough to see the markings on their hulls. Fire erupted once more. Israeli tanks shifted constantly, using every fold of terrain, every shallow ridge. Each shot was deliberate. Ammunition was too precious for mistakes. When shells ran low, crews shared rounds between tanks under fire, passing them hand to hand. A Syrian column tried to break through a narrow gap. Amos' tank fired until the barrel glowed, knocking out one vehicle after another. Return fire slammed into the ground around them, tearing chunks from the rock. Inside a damaged T-62, Khaled shouted for his driver to reverse as a shell struck the turret ring. The tank slewed sideways, controls failing. They bailed out under fire, sprinting across open ground while tracer rounds snapped past them from the ridge. Khaled looked back at the battlefield and understood what was happening. The Israelis were not retreating. They were holding, paying for every meter with steel and blood. By early afternoon, the Syrian advance slowed to a crawl. Conflicting orders filled the radio. Units hesitated. Some tanks turned back, others stalled where they stood. Then came the sound the Israeli crews had been waiting for: new engines, unfamiliar call signs on the radio, reserves. Fresh Israeli tanks arrived, crews thrown into the fight with barely a briefing. They took positions among the survivors, extending the line, closing the gaps that had nearly broken. The final Syrian push collapsed under concentrated fire. One by one, tanks burned or withdrew. The ground fell silent except for the crackle of flames and the distant thud of artillery fading away. Amos climbed out of his tank and looked across the plateau. The scale of the destruction was overwhelming, hundreds of wrecked vehicles stretching toward the horizon. We held, Yossi said, his voice barely above a whisper. On the opposite side, Khaled sat on a rock, helmet resting at his feet, staring at the thin field of ruins. The numbers had promised victory. They had not delivered it. When the fighting finally ceased, the reality settled in. A small, battered force had stopped a massive armored assault. Not through luck, but through training, coordination, and the refusal to give way. Wars are remembered by borders and ceasefire lines, by statistics and official reports. But on the Golan Heights, the truth was written in scorched metal and exhausted faces. Men who had faced impossible odds and paid the price for every decision made far from the battlefield. Courage did not belong to one side alone. Fear did not either. And the cost of that day lingered long after the smoke drifted away.